Hi, and welcome back to another AI in 5. I'm your host, Simon Chris. Joining me today is Shamik Ghosh, and Shamik is the co-founder at Legal Scout. And we're going to be talking about a really critical topic, data sovereignty. Hi, Shamik, and welcome to AI in 5. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hi Simon. Thank you for having me.
Look, we're going to jump right in, and the topic today is really topical. You and I have talked about this before around this topic of data sovereignty, and that's a pretty big catch-all term for a lot of organisations. I'd love to get your view on what data sovereignty is and why it's so critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in technology for more than 25 years, and the number one thing that I've always learned through my career has been know where your data is,
Mm.
because your data is the most important thing that you have. And the ability to ensure your data is stored, protected, and utilized in the right way is most critical because really that's your intellectual property and you should not be giving that away to anyone else.
Mm.
So having the guardrails and protections around that to ensure that your data validity is maintained is the most critical. And that's what I always advise the clients that we work with, even the current environment with Legal Scout, which is really around know where your data is because that's your intellectual property.
And as you know, I do a lot in the sovereign space, and I talk about having the stuff here onshore, owned, operated by Australians. Where do you draw the line on sovereignty? Is it okay if it's onshore, but your storage is being provided by a US company, or where do you draw the line?
So look, ideally, I think to be completely sovereign, you want to be able to have all the way through in terms of ownership of where that data is stored. So making sure the data is resident in Australia, within Australian data centers, within an environment where you can go and actually introspect. I think the way technology has worked nowadays, there are a lot of local providers that provide that level of sovereignty.
Yep.
So definitely some providers will say we are sovereign, but what we find is when you go and dig into where they're sovereign, they're actually just processing some data in Australia and then processing the rest overseas. So this whole notion of sovereign and the notion around AI factories becoming local and resident is what I am a strong believer in, to making sure that you know who actually has access to your data, you know, which company is backing that and what areas do you have guardrails to go and make sure that data is 100% stored in Australia.
And is it that all data needs that level of security, or only certain data, or is there a kind of a cutoff point?
So data, oh, you ask a really good question because data can have various connotations and various usages. I think with AI, a lot of data is actually being used to train the models, whether it's fully transparent or not. Data often is sent overseas to train anonymously, and I think that's, in my opinion, that's not the most secure private solution that you should be going for. Because why should you give away your intellectual property, even if that's anonymized? It's your knowledge, it's your information. So the types of data that I think should be maintained is any data that is your own intellectual property. It's the way that you work in your organization that needs to be sovereign and to your own capabilities. And if that data is used to improve the way you operate and the way you can get the best outcome out of the tool or the solution that you're using from an AI perspective, then in my opinion, that's okay. But again, it has to be completely your own. No one else gets to train on that and no one else gets to access that. That's the critical thing for me.
Yeah, it's around visibility, and you make a good point around where is data processed, because we often hear this phrase "data at rest." Where does that factor in?
Yeah, again, it's sort of interesting because often what ends up happening is data gets stored and then it'll get triaged into another location. So it'll get siphoned off and actually get trained. And we know, knowing a lot of what's happening in the market today, is that's what's going on today. Data actually gets stored and then data at rest actually gets, triaged somewhere else. So it's really important that you understand where that data is again stored and processed again. So data at rest remains really important. because there's an element of data transition, so data in motion, and
Hmm.
most of that these days is secure, right? You've got secure connections to get to that. But once this data is basically at rest, you need to know what's happening with that data at that point in time. And I think a lot of what I've seen in the industry is, and this was a an advent of cloud going back, many years ago, was most enterprises had a very specific notion around I needed to know where my data is because I wanted to go private cloud. And that meant that enterprises went to deploy private data centers to store their data. Then what ended up happening was the cloud providers ended up providing services that were very valuable to the enterprises. So then the enterprises went to the cloud providers and said, actually, you can have my service, but my data needs to be mine and it needs to be stored locally. So then a lot of cloud providers ended up deploying locally. And that meant the data was not being transitioned all around the world. But unfortunately, with AI at the moment, if you go and have a look at what a lot of public GPTs are doing, your data is no longer at rest. It's actually getting stored and then it's actually getting shipped, sent. Yes, it's encrypted and it's all protected, and we get that. But actually, it's going to a data center offshore, most likely in the United States, where it then gets processed and it gets analyzed and it gets pulled apart. Of course, they may not be able to identify you as a user, but it absolutely is getting used to improve their model, to train their model, and actually understand behaviors that you are doing as an enterprise or a user, which is your intellectual property. I keep going back to that. Why would you
Yeah.
give away your intellectual property to someone else that
Yeah.
doesn't and should not own it?
You make a great point, and believe it or not, we're already at time. This could have been a 30-minute episode. In closing, I love to ask everyone the same question. I'll ask you, if an organization is just getting going on their AI journey, or they're just starting to really step into it deeply, what should they be thinking about, or what should they be doing?
I think it's important to ask questions around exactly where your data is getting stored. Ask not just about the physical location, but ask about the suppliers and providers and the mechanisms that are being used to store that data. And ask about the ownership. You raised a great point before, who is actually owning that data once it's leaving your premise and going into a supplier or a provider that's providing you that service. So really, asking those detailed questions around and making sure that you do your due diligence around the responses is really critical, because I think sometimes what we find is if you dig deep into the layers in terms of the response, you'll find that the data is often going overseas. So
Yeah,
please
perfect.
do your due
Perfect.
diligence and really
Putting
ask those
putting
questions.
putting the spotlight back on the procurement team. Shamik, thank you for being a part of AI in 5. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Simon.